recording. All right. Hello, everyone again. My name is Iljoša Petek from PIC. Focus, Humanotera, PIC, and the Slovenian Youth for Climate Justice are co-hosting the second part of the event, which we began yesterday regarding the global climate policy ahead of the Conference of the Parties, or COP26 in Glasgow, which begins at the end of this month. And today we will focus on climate financing. This event takes place as part of the Climate Project, Climate Action by European Citizens Delivers for Development. The project is funded by the EU, and the content of the event is in the domain of the organizers, us, and in no way represents the opinion of the EU. The event will be recorded and later published on our websites and other social media platforms. And thank you again for joining us today. To all the speakers, to all the guests, today's event will be conducted in English as yesterday, and out of consideration to our foreign guest. And before I give the floor to our first speaker, a few opening remarks. As we are discussing climate financing today, it is appropriate to give it some historical and maybe also current context. And I will share a few graphs for you today. I hope you can see this. All right, 5, okay. So I would like to take a few views on how the just transition should be, or better put, what are the historical and the current context of the system that we are in, from the point of view, of course, of the carbon emissions. And here I have one of the graphs for you, which maybe you've seen already. Here we can see what the historical responsibility of the continents and also of some countries is regarding CO2 emissions in the world. And here we can already see a large difference between, let's say, the north and the south, the northern and southern countries. So let's say the western and the eastern. Maybe just a short example from this graph. We can see Africa, South America, Oceania, and so on, they actually put very little emissions historically in the world compared to some other larger and wealthier countries. In the next slide, we see the total CO2 emissions today, so per year. Here we can see that China is absolutely leading, followed by USA, and then followed by Europe, which you can see in yellow here. So these are the largest pollutants today. This is the actual status. Here we see by countries again. Important information from this graph is also the per capita emissions, so emissions per person. And here we can see the United States, Canada, Saudi Arabia, also Australia, and so on are the largest CO2 emitters by capita, per capita. Also a little bit about the income. Here we can see by the income group who emits the most with their lifestyles of CO2. Here we see the high income people, let's say 1.2 billion people emit the most, while we have the upper middle income with the middle emissions, and then we see the vast majority of the people emits the lowest emissions. So we should take this into consideration. This is a little bit about the global wealth distribution. Here we can see, of course, again, this famous 1%, but it is important to see that the top 10% or a little bit more than 10% basically has the most wealth, all the wealth in the world. And here a little bit about the distribution of the world's wealth by countries today. We can see United States, China, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and so on. So this is by continents and also by countries. What I wanted to put into your heads before we start with our first presenter is that we should consider the distribution of wealth and also the historical contributions when we are talking about climate financing. So this is very shortly from my side and how I would like to invite our first speaker today, Rachel Simon. She is a climate and development policy coordinator at CAN Europe, formerly also climate and energy policy officer, who got her master's degree at the University of Bristol in the field of corporate carbon emissions for engaged tracking. And today she will present the topic of climate financing ahead of COP26. And Rachel, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the introduction and the invitation. And also, I think the really useful opening presentation slides, which really set the context for the discussion on climate finance. So I'm just going to share my slides and then we can get started. I think that some of you attended a presentation from my colleague Sven yesterday on the bigger picture on COP26. And so I'm going to go more in depth on the climate finance side. And our overall message as Climate Action Network Europe towards COP26 is that it needs to be fair for 1.5. I think we all know about the Paris Agreement's objective to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. But from our view, that should be done in a fair and equitable way. And climate finance is a key part of that picture. So we know that we've got to limit temperature rise and to 1.5 degrees to rule out the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And finance really plays a key role in doing that, both in terms of shifting economies out of the bad, out of fossil fuels, high carbon and polluting activities, and shifting economies towards the good. So financing and investing green and sustainable development. And I think the third crucial element to that is that, as highlighted on the opening slides, we've got to consider historical responsibility when we look at how we shift those finance flows. We've got to look at who's got the most capacity to act and who's emitted the most previously. And so we really do call on Europe and the EU collectively to do more, because they are a richer economy collectively and because they've got a greater responsibility to act, given they've been emitting for many, many more years than many of the most climate vulnerable countries. So I'll just start by then going through some of the types of climate finance before we look at the Paris Agreement. You'll probably be familiar with these, but in the Paris Agreement, we put financing into certain categories. So around mitigation, and examples could be, of course, financing renewable energy, cleaner transportation. I think we also need to look a lot more at investing in and providing finance to ensure that nature is protected, because that's also kind of mitigating activity. And then there's adaptation, which you'll probably be familiar with as well, making our cities and our homes more resilient to climate impacts like extreme weather events or floods, looking at monitoring weather to make sure we're prepared. And that's an example you can see here on the slide, which may be a bit more unusual, is that a way of adapting is actually being prepared. And here, communities are making use of satellite data to inform them about changes in weather early on, so that they can then make sure that, they protect their agriculture systems make sure that they're not going to be hit out in an extreme weather event when it hits. So that's mitigation and adaptation. There's a third category of activity which requires finance, and that's financing for losses and damages. And losses and damages are basically what happens when climate change hits and you can't adapt anymore to protect yourself. And maybe you're going to lose some income, or you might be forced to move. So migration or human displacement is also a form of loss and damage. You might lose your business, you might lose your home. But there are also some, it's important to say there are also some losses which we can't really quantify, which might be losses to your ancestral land or some losses to your culture. And so the types of finance that you can look at to address loss and damage could be types of insurance, so that then when you're hit, you get a payout. It could be very simply kind of grants and cash payments to those who need them after crisis. Another type of loss and damage finance could be, if you look at a climate vulnerable country, a developing country, that might have already high debt levels, and then they're hit by climate change and then like a superstorm, then I think debt cancellation or debt relief in the aftermath of that storm is also another way to try and support them, try and get finance flowing towards them so that they can rebuild. So yeah, those are the main categories of finance that we look at across the Paris Agreement. And now I'll just go a bit more into detail into what the Paris Agreement actually says and what's happening at the UNFCCC on climate finance. So thinking back to that issue about historical responsibility and capacity to act, that's recognized in the Paris Agreement through a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. And that basically means that the agreement recognizes there are richer countries who can do more, and then there are poorer countries who are more climate vulnerable. So under the agreement, the richer countries have agreed to provide $100 billion annually from 2020 to 25 to the poorer countries, and particularly looking at the least developed countries and small islands as well. And in addition, parties agreed to try and balance the finance between mitigation and adaptation. Note, they did not agree to provide loss and damage finance. So that's a key climate finance objective under the Paris Agreement, that 100 billion, and it came into force last year. But that's in place from 2020 to 25. What we've also got to think about is future finance needs. There'll be a new goal that's going to be negotiated that will come in after 2025. And there are going to be discussions on that at COP. People are going to start thinking about what that goal should look like, how much money it should be, who should contribute. So those are the long-term finance goals. As mentioned, the Paris Agreement includes the concept of loss and damage, and that's in Article 8, if you want to go and have a look. But unfortunately, and this is a political issue, it's down to rich countries not wanting to pay more. So far, loss and damage finance hasn't been a recognized concept or action that needs to happen. So at COP26, there's really a great weight of expectation from the climate vulnerable countries on the one hand, who are experiencing heavy losses and damages from more and more superstorms, hurricanes, etc., sea level rise. And then the richer countries on the other hand, including the EU, but also Australia, particularly US, Japan, who don't want to recognize loss and damage finance. And that's mainly because they don't want to pay more. They don't want to be kind of seen as culpable for climate change, I would say. A few other bits and pieces that are important to know. There's some elements in the Paris Agreement about climate finance reporting. So when the rich countries provide that climate finance, how should they report it? And another important strand that's relevant is that there's a gender action plan, which is being progressed through at the UNFCCC negotiations. And I think that's really important to link to finance. I mean, as NGOs, we say that climate finance should be more gender responsive, but basically that it needs to deliver on gender equality. How can we ensure basically that money gets to the hands of women and girls? and supports their economic development. And finally, something in the Paris Agreement on all financial flows. So I put it last because I don't think there's as much to say about it in the negotiations, but it's actually one of the key long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. It's the third goal, and that is to make all finance flows consistent with Paris Agreement goals. So that's not just looking at the flows between the North and the South, between the rich and the poor countries. That's how can we change our global financial system. This is, again, I would say, a very political topic because we have lots of very highly fossil fuel dependent economies and countries who are parties to the Paris Agreement. And so making progress on this is quite difficult. But there are lots of things going on outside the negotiations, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. So that's a kind of roundup of what's in the Paris Agreement. Where are we now? Unfortunately, when it comes to that $100 billion goal, I've just got a bit of data on this one, we're not there, and we're not achieving that goal. So this is some data from the OECD, which looked at the climate finance flows between the rich and the poor countries over the last 7 years. And basically it looks like we're not on track. And that's even using a methodology that as NGOs and also climate vulnerable countries, we would be quite critical of. But they put us as roughly $20 billion short in 2019. I'll just share an alternative analysis. This is from Oxfam, and we think they have a more robust way of assessing where we are in terms of that 100 billion. And they say that we're even further off track, and that in 2017 to 18, rich countries were only providing a very small proportion of what they were saying. And you can see there on the graph on the right-hand side, they put it around 20 billion, which is not much at all. So there's lots of, that's to highlight that, well, firstly, we're off track on the 100 billion, but secondly, there are lots of problems with the way that it's reported on by countries. And here I wanted to provide, in the run-up to COP, the latest priorities from the EU. So the EU acts together at the COP in the negotiations. So it shares common positions and it acts as one body. And every year it announces at a council meeting what its climate finance priorities will be for COP. And here is just a bit of a summary. And I've highlighted what's good and bad. I mean, the EU continues to say it's committed to that 100 billion goal. The problem is I don't think it's doing enough to make sure that it's reached. It does have some good attention to adaptation finance, which I think it's important to highlight. It also has quite a constructive position on the 100 billion, on the future long-term finance goal. But on the downside, it doesn't have any mention of loss and damage finance, and that's because it doesn't have a position of wanting to progress that topic at COP26. If we step outside the negotiations and we look at the bigger picture on finance, it is saying, the EU is saying some good things about how we need to phase out finance for fossil fuels, but at the moment that's quite restricted to looking at international finance for fossil fuels, so the finance outside the EU, and it's also focused on coal rather than looking at all fossil fuels. So I'll just round up by giving you an idea what our core demands are, as can Europe, which we've been pushing all year. And now we, in the weeks up to the COP, we've been really doing a lot of advocacy on. So firstly, because we're off track on that 100 billion, we call on all European countries and the EU collectively to increase the climate finance that they're giving to poorer countries, to really scale up. And it's important that that finance is of good quality as well. And what we think that means is that they should be giving more finance to adaptation, which is currently underfinanced, but also that the finance is gender responsive. So it's reaching the hands of women and girls. And it's important to say here that the EU member states, they give climate finance bilaterally, and then they also contribute to the EU budget, and through that they give collectively. So there are two ways that they're giving, and I think Barbara is going to take you into a bit more detail on that side. And then what do we want to see at COP26? We want to see the EU taking an ambitious approach when it starts to talk about this new climate finance goal, which is going to come into force up to 2025. So it should be ensuring that there's enough finance in that goal and that they learn lessons on what's been happening over the last 10 years on climate finance. We're also calling at the negotiations for the EU to support progress on loss and damage finance. And that means that countries have to start thinking creatively about where that money could come from. If they're not going to give it from their public budgets, then there are lots of other options to look at, like looking at taxing international aviation and maritime transport, a climate damages tax on the most polluting companies, for example, and debt cancellation is another example. And then on the sidelines of the negotiations, so they might not be in the negotiation rooms when they're doing this, but we think it's really important that European governments, EU member states, and financial institutions try to drive forward progress on shifting all financial flows. And that means looking at, I think, the most urgent thing to look at is shifting money out of the bad. So phasing out fossil fuel finance. And so we're calling on them to make a new commitment to urgently phase out fossil fuel finance, coal, oil and gas, and across the whole value chain as well. And there are some countries who are looking to sign up to a statement on that. So I think that will be something to look out for at COP26. How ambitious is that statement on fossil fuel finance, and how many countries have signed up to it? So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe one general question before we move on to the next speaker. So you already explained and stated that we're way off track regarding the quality and also the quantity of the climate financing ahead of COP. You also mentioned one of the most important parts. This is phasing out the fossil industry, basically phasing out financing fossil industry. So what are your expectations regarding this conference? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I guess it's important to say that there's going to be quite a bad tone, or not a great mood, hanging over the finance discussions as a whole, because this 100 billion hasn't been met. And so countries have been doing a bit of homework in the run-up to COP and looking a bit more into that and seeing, developing what's called a delivery plan to try to ensure the 100 billion is met until 2025. Unfortunately, that's not looking very good. So I think the dynamic between the climate vulnerable countries, so the African group of negotiators, the alliance of small island states, and the developing countries more broadly, are going to be making the case quite rightly that not enough is being done to support them. On the other hand, there are some positive signs on the quality side, as you mentioned, particularly from some EU member states who, for example, some of them launched an adaptation champions group to push the issue of adaptation finance and committed to give more adaptation finance. There are, I mean, the EU as a whole is relatively good in comparison to Australia, US, Japan, etc. So I think it can potentially be a bit of a bridge builder there, and try to find the space between the climate vulnerable countries and the rest, and try to drag forward the US and others, because Biden, I would say, has of course improved on President Trump, but the US is still not giving its fair share if you look at its historical emissions and how rich it is.
All right, thank you. And we will have again the Q&A session in the end after all the presentations. I would like to invite all the guests, if you have any questions, write them down in chat, or you can ask them as well live in the end later. So now I would like to invite our next presenter, Barbara Quatz from Focus, who has extensive national and international experience in various environmental fields, such as climate and energy policy, global responsibility, responsible consumption, etc. Barbara will present both her international and national take on climate financing. And Barbara, thank you for joining us again today, and the field is yours.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. I will just continue from where Rachel stopped, and I will give you some figures of the Slovene contribution to international climate finance. And later on, I'll talk about financing climate measures in Slovenia. So first of all, to say since 2013 till now, the international climate finance from Slovenia is increasing. While it was a bit less than 2 million euro in 2013, it was a good 5.7 million in 2019. For the 2019, 2 million was the participation in Green Climate Fund, and the rest was used for bilateral contributions and projects. Now, the good thing about the international climate finance in Slovenia is that it's almost 100% is in grants, so no loans, which is a good thing. But the bad thing that I would say here is it is not enough. It would be expected from Slovenia to participate more. It is also not new and additional, so this money is also counted into official development aid. While the countries did commit to provide new and additional, but not only Slovenia has issues with that. And also the balance between adaptation and mitigation is not there at all. I don't think that any of the adaptation projects were financed with Slovenian international climate finance. And looking ahead, and now we haven't heard any new promises from our government towards the COP26, but we do know that the National Climate Fund has allocated funds for both Green Climate Fund contribution and the bilateral projects in the period of 2021-2023. And 1 million is allocated for Green Climate Fund and 1.5 million for bilateral projects in the next 3 years. So from that, I think if this is the only thing that Slovenia is going to contribute, it's probably, we can say that will not act on its commitment to contribute its fair share to the international efforts. And then for the national level, I would just say I didn't quite know how to structure this contribution today, but I figured then maybe I should start with the needs. And the needs were for the climate, for financing of climate measures in Slovenia were assessed both in the National Energy and Climate Plan as well as in long-term climate strategy for Slovenia. And the NSCP assesses the need of 28 billion euros in the period 2021-2030. And the long-term climate strategy says that to become climate neutral by 2050, 66 to 71 billion euros will be needed. This depends on the scenario that will be chosen. There, as you probably, the Slovene people would know, that there were two scenarios, energy scenarios assessed in the long-term climate strategy, one being synthetic gas and the other nuclear, and nuclear was chosen, which is also the more expensive one. This needs cover all the money that is needed, so private and public, and of course I can't talk about the private, but I can say something about the public finance that we have though. So we have in Slovenia 3 main sources of finance for climate measures at national level. One being the revenues from auctioning of emission allowances from the ETS installations. 100% of these revenues are earmarked, and they go to climate fund, and the climate fund then finances measures that are decided in the program of measures to be financed. And this is usually it's a 2-year program, but yeah, if not always, it can be only 1 year after that is already being changed. The other source in Slovenia is a contribution for energy efficiency, which is paid by the end users of energy, and it goes to EcoFund. EcoFund then from this funds subsidizes energy efficiency and renewables measures for households, but also gives out loans for small businesses and households. And third source is a contribution for renewables and highly efficient CHP. So heat and power combined. I lost the word. And this one goes to, this money is then used for supporting the uptake of renewables. It can be used as operational or the investment support for renewables. Important to mention here also CHP in here that is being financed as well. It's not just for renewables, but also for CHP. That's usually gas, because it's a high efficient CHP. The other, so these are the main national sources, but there's also the European funds, and there we have the cohesion policy funds, common agriculture policy funds, and from now on, there's also, I mean, the two new bigger sources now for climate action are as well Just Transition Fund, where Slovenia would have the ability to get 253 million, and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, under which we've already prepared a plan to how to use it. And I'll say a bit more later on about it. Another potential source, which is not a source for currently, I mean, it's not earmarked for climate action, is the CO2 tax. So the CO2 tax is collected but goes into a big pot, and potentially.
Sorry. There's something going on with your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Everything's okay now.
Sorry. So CO2 tax could be, it was also identified in the NSCP as a potential new source if the CO2 tax is earmarked and doesn't go into a big pot where it's lost or used for other issues. But now we have these funds available, but there are also problems with it. So Rachel mentioned before the need to stop financing fossil fuels and so on in the future. And we have a problem with harmful subsidies in Slovenia as well. For example, in 2019, there were, for the measures in the non-ETS, so that's the sectors covered, like buildings, waste, transport, and agriculture. There was 71 million spent for subsidies in these sectors, while on the other side there was 90 million subsidies spent on fossil fuels. Mainly, these are the large part of these harmful subsidies go to reimbursement of excise duties for diesel in commercial use. Also, there is a plan in the NSCP to gradually reduce these harmful subsidies, but currently there has been by 2030, not before. And also so far, there's all, I mean, some things should have happened already during this year to approach this problem, but haven't. And there are also new harmful subsidies being planned currently. And these are the so-called indirect costs for the most polluting industry sectors that are included in the ETS sector. Then there is a problem with planning of the EU funds, this being not very transparent. For example, now the spending is being planned for the next for the period of 2021-2027 for the cohesion policy, and public haven't heard anything about it yet. And this was also a problem with planning the use of recovery and resilience facility for the plan that was made in Slovenia. Another issue with that fund is that, like, we would have been allowed to get 5.7 billion from that side, but we made a plan. I mean, the government made the plan to spend only 2.5 billion by 2026. 1.8 of that is foreseen to go to grants and 666 million to loans. And out of this 2.5 billion, about 1 billion is allocated to green transition. And within that, about 50-50 for loans and subsidies or grants. The other problem that we've seen, I mean, this fund is important because it's a lot of money. It covers the period when the country should do a major step forward in reducing emissions. And this is like, for the small countries like Slovenia, where the national funds are limited, it could be a major help in helping the transition. But yeah, so that we've not even decided to spend all the money that was available for grants is a negative. Also, then how the plan is made. You can see from the plan that the bulk of the projects will be financed from this fund are basically grey built infrastructure, which has questionable impacts on the emission reductions and on the nature as well, which is then again connected with the effects on the emission reduction effects. Also, this plan also doesn't really take into consideration the analysis that were done on the needs in the NSCP. So, for example, there needs assessed for renewables deployment, for the power grid investments, for the transport, and so on. And these are exactly the sectors that are basically got under allocated funds in this. Like, for example, I can give you an example. 400 million per year is estimated to be needed for the power grid investments, while the entire only 80 million is allocated in this fund for the entire period for the same issue. Yeah, and then there's also the new one, the Just Transition Fund. I suspect Jakob will be talking more about that as well. 253 million is possible to get out of this fund for Slovenia. We have two we have two coal transition regions in Slovenia. Most of this money would go to Šaleška region, where we still have an operating coal power plant and coal mine. But the problem is that the strategy was prepared and is now stuck somewhere because the government cannot agree on the coal exit date. And if this is not, I mean, if this doesn't come to a conclusion, then we might even lose this money. So there's a lot of, I mean, if I would sum up now what I've been saying is that there are revenues available at national level, but also the EU level. The problem is with how they're spent, and they're spent without taking into consideration the prioritizing the needs that should be financed first, and also the prioritization is a problem, and not all, because like if you have all these funds and EU funds and so there more can be the funds can be used, should be used in a way that they contribute to several objectives that we're pursuing, and most of this money could have effects also on climate goals if it would be planned properly. That's it.
All right, thank you, Barbara. I will ask you a similar question as I asked Rachel, but from the Slovenian point of view. So we have the Slovenian presidency of the EU. We have some, let's say, a little bigger role at the COP, and then we have also the after effect of the COP on the Slovenian government and Slovenia in general. So what do you think will change in the terms of Slovenian climate finance after COP?
Don't think, well, depends if on the national, I think the COP won't have much impact on the spending on the national level. It could, if there like additional commitments made during the COP on the international climate finance, this would probably be respected in the future, but I don't expect that immediately Slovenia will substantially increase the international climate finance, or that it will increase it to like its fair share anytime soon.
All right, thank you, Barbara. And now I would like to present our final speaker, Jakub Sever-Klesins from the Youth for Climate Justice, the Slovenian Youth for Climate Justice. Jakub is a young climate and environmental activist, and he will tell us a little bit about what the movement's perspectives are regarding a just financing of the just transition. So Jakub, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me just get my presentation set up. Is it like, can everybody see it? Okay, so I will be discussing like financing a sustainable transition and how the Youth for Climate Justice sees a possible sustainable transition. So first of all, we want to emphasize what a sustainable transition even is. In general, this is development intended to reestablish ecologically destructive industries as ecologically sustainable industries. We emphasize that the sustainable transition must be just, meaning that those who are hurt because of the climate change should be compensated, and those who are responsible for climate change should be the ones compensating the ones who are hurt. Now we also want to establish what does it mean for the transition to be unjust. This has many side effects. First of all, it lowers the life expectancy of the people who are affected by the transition. It lowers their general employment income, and there's a dramatic shift in the demographic and fiscal imbalance. And then there's also the major impacts that it has on minorities and others who are affected by the transition. So we will point out the key features of each transition that make it first sustainable and then make it just. So firstly, we have identification of key stakeholders. So these are communities, workers, and companies which are affected by the transition. And then there are the minorities and the people inside the communities that are affected as well. So these are women, elders, people with disabilities, people with a lower level of education, might even be people of non-binary genders, people who are LGBTQ, and so on. So basically minorities in general. We emphasize that we need to identify the key stakeholders so that we can as we go on with the additional points, incorporate them adequately into all of them. And firstly, for that, we also need to be transparent and honest with the transition, which means that all information must be written in a clear and concise way, so that everybody can understand them, no matter what their level of education is. And additionally, we emphasize the fact that we need to communicate with the people who are affected. And this means that we need to constantly check on the conditions and standards of the people who are working, and the conditions of the working conditions. So and this is why we emphasize the importance of communicating with the key stakeholders, so that you have their point of view, how they feel and how they are being incorporated into the general transition. And because the only way you can make a transition just is to actually include the key stakeholders. This also means that you make changes adequately and whenever they are necessary. You constantly need to be monitoring and adjusting whatever is happening so that it fits the necessary standards. Then there is the general compensation that applies to all. So first of all, there needs to be an income compensation, which means that workers who are being relocated to a different industry need full wage for their time of re-education, or if they're going straight into employment, the government must provide the difference between the past and the new wage. All of this would be done in the time that it takes for re-education to occur. For example, in Slovenia, the standard time of re-education is 7 years, meaning that the government has to provide the full wage for the time of re-education, which is 7 years, and provide the difference between the past and the new wage to the worker for 7 years. If somebody doesn't choose to go into education once again, but straight up into employment, and still after 1 year of unemployment, the government then must provide them a sustainable job, and then which has to constitute either 70% of their previous wage or at least the minimum wage. And we see that this as of high importance, because even if somebody doesn't go back and try to reinstate themselves within some industry in on the local level and give back to the community, it still means that they are reinstated in the state's the government's employment, meaning that they again provide certain resources and provide actual labor. And then there is the matter of requalification and re-education, which is a key factor because of the fact that for a worker to be able to enter the workforce again, if they want to go into a different sector of the economy, they need to be brought up on all of the things that have changed or new information entirely. However, we also don't believe that this is necessary for every worker, especially the ones working in power plants and stuff, because most of the time the knowledge that they have acquired from one power on a specific type of power plant can be transmitted onto another type of power plant. For example, let's say we are trying to relocate the people who are working, reinstate the people who are working in a coal power plant. If we reinstate them in I don't know, a hydro power plant, this would mean that their skills would most likely need some updating, but it wouldn't be as necessary as if we were moving them entirely to a different sector. Meaning that even in most cases, whenever we are like participating in a transition, it doesn't like suck up as much resources as one can like expect. Secondly, but whenever it does like suck up additional resources, and the person needs to be requalified and re-educated, the government is still expected to provide the full compensation for their education. This also, like in general, contributes to the sustainable expansion of the affected regions which are affected by the transition, because people then are able to move into fields which are like sustainable, but which are also but which can also be specific to the region that they are working in. Meaning that like the region would still like see economic growth and would still see like expansion and development, even if like it is moving and shutting down an entire industry, because and basically the government has to take some like has to go into debt for that. Yeah. Then there are additional costs, like accounting for other like minutia. So first of all, transport costs and meal costs and moving costs. So first of all, like we emphasize the fact that they need to be like that the government has to compensate the people who are moving from one sector to another with transport, compensate their transport costs, which would be like done through public transports, meaning that like they provide them the tickets for like yearly transport while they are acquiring new employment, or they provide them public transport for the time of re-education. And then there's like meal costs, which are obvious because like you need to provide a standard level of like livability. And then there are moving costs, which are costs which would be like rare, but they would occur because of the fact that re-education and new employment might mean relocation. So for example, if you want to go into a specific field, you need to study for that field, it would mean that you'd have to like move to another to another city to be able to study that field. Or if you were like going and taking up another job, it could mean that you'd have to move to a different part to actually work that job. And this is something that, because you are taking up another job because of the transition, this is something that again the government needs to cover, and like the workers need to be compensated for. And it also means that like they cannot give, like they shouldn't be taking like money out of their own bank account, because like that could potentially lower their living standards, which is something that we really want to avoid, to provide like an easy and just transition. Then there is the preferential treatment, which would be like essential for allowing minorities and people who would usually be most affected to have to be able to reinstate themselves as easily as possible. So like this, to everybody that would be like included in the transition, that would be like a standard preferential treatment, meaning that whenever they are applying for employment, housing, and education, there would be certain preferences applied to like when they are being picked out. For example, this is the most basic one that can be implemented when people are equal like on all things. People who have like who are a part of a transition will be picked out way more than other ones who aren't like a part of a transition. Then there is preferential treatment based on age, because of the fact that people who are over the age of 50 face like different circumstances when it comes to re-education and like entering the workforce again. It would mean that we would provide a longer and increased compensation for those people, meaning that it also eased their ability to like go through that transition. And it would mean, and this is especially important because most of the people who are working in industries which are like coal power plants and coal mines are quite old. And then there is preferential treatment based on gender, level of education, and disabilities. This is like, again, going back to the minorities. So this is like, again, the same preferential treatment would apply, but with an additional preference, meaning that if you have two people, and like both of them are a part of their transition, but one of them is, say, like a woman, or like has a different level of education, or has a disability, they would be the ones who like have a higher chance of being picked out, because like searching for another like employment, housing, or education is much harder for them, meaning that that they would be the ones who would be treated preferentially, because other people have like an easier time because of the fact they don't have like a lower level of education, certain disabilities, and all that. So lastly, there are some things when it comes to reinvesting and securing. So basically, this is making sure that like, firstly, that the transition is in practice sustainable, and secondly, that it doesn't affect the wider market. So firstly, securing the sustainable transition means that like upholding standards of working and ecological conditions, meaning that you have to constantly make sure that the compensation and the resources provided are ecologically sustainable and provide good working conditions, because we don't want to be like investing a lot of money and a lot of resources into like transitioning from one industry to another industry, later finding out that like because of the way that the new industry operates, it actually causes a lot more pollution and ecological destruction than the industry from which we are transitioning. And this is something that needs to be constantly updated and refined. But this doesn't also like only apply to industries. This also applies to like housing and employment opportunities, which are provided to the people who are a part of the transition. Meaning that, for example, the preferential treatment, which we have previously talked about, wouldn't be provided for if people would be applying to things which aren't ecologically like beneficial, and or for which working conditions wouldn't be adequate. So it means that there is again a bigger incentive for people to go and to work in things which are ecologically sustainable and things which don't contribute more pollution than like what was previously from what we are transitioning. And then there is the wider economic diversification and development. This has already slightly been covered by the previous topics of simply people like stepping back into the working industry. But here we have additional opportunities to actually like foster additional for the additional growth and development. So in this instance, we would have the government like trying to incentivize certain new innovations and companies in the region in which is experiencing the transition. This would mean borrowing money at lower interest rates for the companies, instituting subventions for the companies, or lowering the debts that they have to pay, meaning that there would be a bigger incentive for people who are experiencing a transition to start up their own company, to again go back to the region where they are working and to reinvest back into the community which they are a part of, which again means economic diversification and further development on the region that is experiencing the transition. And this can also mean that like it provides additional employment opportunities for people who are a part of the transition, and can even mean that like after the transition there are more employment, housing, and other opportunities for people after the transition, even if like there was a whole industry that was shut down. I think this would be all. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Jakob. I'm always impressed by the knowledge that comes out of young people, especially the movement here in Slovenia. You were very precise. You made a lot of concrete points. So I have a related question. You were talking a lot about the preferential treatment for different groups of people. And one of these groups of people is also the youth. Of course, not all the youth needs and deserves basically, let's say, a preferential treatment, but for those parts that do, what do you think should be done at the conference of the parties, or maybe in the global climate policy in the future, to better empower actually the youth regarding the rights that you have in your future as well, the rights of the future generations, and how to make the public participation regarding the youth at these proceedings and decision-making levels, how to make it better?
Like most of the time when something like the youth participation is in question, I feel like it's in part responsible because of like simply mistrusting the youth and like saying that they aren't able. So simply having the youth be present during certain meetings and having them as public figures would like contribute to like a wider like view of the youth as like actual decision makers and people who are responsible. Otherwise, like programs which include like focus specifically on youth and their development and how like they want to see the world develop and like helping them develop this vision of the world would also be highly like constitutive.
All right, thank you. And now I would like to ask all three speakers to join me for the Q&A session. I would also like to invite all the guests to, if you have any question, raise your hand or write in the chat. Maybe a few questions from my side for the beginning. So we were already talking about the off-track situation of the climate financing at the global level. I would like to maybe hear a little bit more about which sectors, which lobbies are basically those who are the most successful in acquiring the climate funding. And also, maybe if you have any ideas regarding that, how are local communities or local businesses, smaller businesses, being acknowledged within this really big picture of those $100 billion and so forth? So yeah, how are they being processed here? Which are the strongest lobbies and how are the smaller ones being, let's say, considered? Maybe Rachel and Barbara.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we see from our NGO perspective, far too much money going into kind of big mega projects which don't necessarily benefit the smallest communities. So if you're looking outside of the EU and looking to the finance to the climate vulnerable countries, we see a lot of money being channeled through big development banks like the EIB. And so a very large share of the EU's climate finance is actually in the form of loans, and the EIB is quite a big actor there. And so they, for example, because they deal with such vast amounts of money, they often only deal with really big actors who can handle that capacity. I mean, it's not always bad, but you do have to look at some of these big mega renewable projects and challenge the EIB doesn't necessarily have a great human rights record, and look at, you know, are local communities part of that process? Are they being consulted? But I mean, renewables is the obvious case. There's also a lot of lending on transport, developing transport systems, agriculture as well, but to a lesser extent. And the way to get money flowing to communities is really that question of the quality. So the grants-based finance, which is more likely to be going to public bodies or to community level, and to smaller actors, kind of microfinancing initiatives like cash payouts. And that's, I think, where it's most needed, where it's the hardest to reach areas, is where you need to get that grants finance, because they're not able to necessarily attract the bigger investors. And also adaptation, I should mention, is particularly difficult to get financing for adaptation. So grants for adaptation are really important because it's difficult to get a return on investment. So there's not much lending going on there. Thanks.
Maybe, I agree with what Rachel said, but maybe as maybe a good example from Slovenia. Within this bilateral projects that Slovenia finance as a climate finance, under the climate finance title, there are also project finance that are executed by non-NGOs in the third countries, and they were, I think there were recently 2 projects financed. One was in Rwanda and one was in Uganda, I think, and they were working with local communities in their resource efficiency, access to food and water. So these are, I think, good practice examples that should be probably multiplied if we want the money to actually reach to the ground, to the most needed people.
Thank you. And maybe Jakob, again, you were very precise in your presentation, but what would be, if you could imagine 2 or 3, let's say very concrete, very precise examples of where the climate funding should go? You know, I'm thinking about, let's say, a specific area or a specific sector where you think it would be most well used, or where you think as a young member of EU and so on, where do you think it should go primarily?
Well, I feel like I just spoken about like the transition projects. So like for me, it would most likely be like identifying the key like polluters and providers of like ecological disaster, and then like moving the key actors out of there and like trying to shut down the industries with as little like as little resistance as possible. So specifically, like coal power plants, for example, are like still active and still like harmful to the environment. Those are something like highly specific, and with a full plan, and then like I have just explained, still can be like examined and like relocated. Otherwise, there's also like specific things to do, such as like education, making people simply more aware, I feel like would do a lot of like great things. Yeah, so like most likely focusing on like identifying key polluters and then trying to relocate and reinvest the energy and the resources that they use up.
Okay, thank you. And a follow-up question to all three. How to make this phasing out of coal and of fossil fuels acceptable? You mentioned, Jakob, to make it, you know, as just as possible, to make it as smooth, basically, as possible. But maybe some concrete examples of how to make this really acceptable. And this is a question for all three of you.
I can go first. Yeah, I did want to comment on this because I thought the Just Transition presentation from Jakob was really interesting. And I didn't touch on this earlier, but we should expect that there should be an announcement at COP26 from a number of countries on the phase out of coal. And that will include some language around what should be done to support communities and sectors that are most affected. So that's a kind of political statement that we should look out for. I think it's called something like, it's from Coal to Clean statement or something like that, but it'll be coming out in the next 2 weeks. And I think, you know, there's some language there about the just transition. What's just really important is that that's not just words, and that the appropriate measures and finances there to support communities, but that they're also, you know, they've got a voice in the transition as well. Apart from that, I thought Jakob made some very good points about what a just transition can look like. So I think, yeah, that was some really good examples.
Yeah, how to make it acceptable. I think we have to think about why we want to phase out coal, and that, in my opinion, is a big chunk of the acceptance. So we have to stop burning coal if we want to address climate change in an effective way. And just the realization that that is just what needs to be done is one thing that's we need to have in our mind. But then, of course, yes, the workers and the communities affected by the transition away from coal should be consulted, should have an active part in coming up with plans and strategies of how to deal with that. But yeah, the point that I wanted to make was that we have to make it acceptable, and we have to have people in front of us when we talk about what to do and where to do it.
I personally feel like that, like nobody actually like willingly contributes towards like pollution and stuff. So by going directly to the community and saying like, here are the things that are wrong, which most likely you are already aware of and don't want to do, and saying to them like, here is what you can do, and it's really easy, and like it will be like really smooth for you, and you'll have the ability to do this and this, which you previously did not have. I feel like people are like would be a lot more willing to do that than to like simply be like thrown to either like on the limb for themselves, like go and work somewhere else, or like have the government like simply shut down a power plant and like make it so that they aren't able to work anywhere else. I feel like people would like by themselves go and accept this, since what they are being presented is so clear. And yes, as Rachel spoke, we need to be like concise, clear, and honest with the communities. But we also need to make sure, as Barbara said, that this is like something that needs to be done. So yeah, I feel like there's like a clear line that we walk, and along those lines are like good choices.
Thank you. And maybe more to the local or specific examples. Maybe Barbara, if you can identify, or if you know of any, let's say, good examples here in Slovenia, which are, I don't know, already happened or are about to happen or are supposed to happen. So it's a very broad question. But if you know, yeah, of any local examples of, let's say, well-started just transition, and if you don't, maybe what would be a good first case?
I don't actually know any concrete examples, but maybe it's a local issue. It's not directly linked to the coal phase out, but it is an issue of just transition. Is also the fuel poverty, energy poverty issue. And I think in Slovenia, while we are still at the beginning, and so but we have some good examples on how to dealing with it. So we have a program financed by Eco Fund that like provides energy consulting to households, and also gives out free tools to lower the consumption of energy and water. And there's also now a bigger chunk of money available, and is already being spent on actual investments in the buildings to lower the energy demand. I think that is, yeah, the whole, in the framework of just transition, the whole Europe will have to deal with energy poverty as well, specifically now when we have the new legislation is being proposed, and there's a it's likely, very likely that the households will carry additional costs because of the introduction of the new ETS for buildings and transport. And so the issue of energy poverty will become bigger in countries, and yeah, good examples on dealing with energy poverty, I think, are important in this context as well.
Thank you. And maybe Rachel, where do the private funds come from? So we talked a lot and we know a lot about the public funds, but maybe private funding of climate funding, where does it come from?
So maybe I look at the international finance first, and then the finance in the EU. In terms of the finance flows to poorer countries, there is a big emphasis on trying to involve private sector actors. And so the EU might do that by, for example, investing in a company, or like lowering the cost of a loan. Again, I mean, there's good and bad there. I mean, of course, it has to be done, and we need to align all financial flows towards the climate goals. I think you also have to be careful about reaching the smaller private actors, so those micro businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises that are really the main bulk of the economy in lots of low-income countries. And we're not necessarily seeing them being supported. We're often seeing bigger companies being supported. When it comes to the EU, there's quite a big effort to shift private finance. So the EU's developed a new, what's called taxonomy, where it tries to classify what is green, basically. What is green, climate mitigation, adaptation, environmental, etc. And also some do no harm principles. And that's still being finalized. We don't know what that will look like eventually. At the moment, there's a bit of a risk that it could include nuclear and fossil gas in the green category. So that's a bit, obviously going to be a big stumbling block if the EU goes down that route, which it looks like it will. But then that taxonomy could be used, will be used in certain EU legislation, but could also be adopted by more companies to show the outside world that they're green and to try and attract investment. Yeah, and the EU is very much promoting that taxonomy as a standard internationally as well. So we'll see where that goes and what it looks like eventually.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions from the guests? If there are no questions, then I would like to thank first all three speakers. Thank you for your interesting and well-prepared presentations. And thank you for everyone for participating and coming to this event. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you're taking the information with you. And yeah, that's it. All the best.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tako.
Tako. Jaj, ne bom več.
Ne, vse super, vse dobro. Jaz sem posnel, tudi tole snemam, ko bom zaključil, aha, stop recording. Čakaj.